Let me just say something about immediate struggles, people, power and place in rural Europe, which I wrote with Susanna Narodsky. In a sense, this was a specific challenge and a general challenge. The specific challenge was, how can you write an ethnography with the traditions of anthropological fieldwork about an area or a region that is so thoroughly entwined with a much larger area, so Spain, the European Union, and so on. So how would we write an ethnography that would be useful, that would look at this particular, this kind of thing? I mean, I think in some senses, if I think about my Peruvian research, there's one thing, whatever else one might feel about the Peruvian society historically and various authoritarian regimes and violence and so on and so forth, the fact of the matter is that people knew that they were from Huasicancha. They felt very strongly about it, and there was no question. I, as an anthropologist, had no problem at all knowing who the people were who I was studying when I said I wanted to study the people of Huasicancha. And they didn't have any difficulty with that either. That was certainly not the case once I started to do fieldwork in rural Spain, where you've got a situation where people have been deeply embedded in the nation state for centuries, and whose whole sense of themselves collectively and individually is at least partly influenced by the fact that they have long been citizens of a quite sophisticated state apparatus, if you like. So then you find yourself as an anthropologist doing a kind of regional study, which is what I was trying to do in southern Valencia. And you're asking yourself, okay, how am I going to make this relevant to a bigger question about Europe, or how am I even going to sort of think about these people in a way that anthropologists think about people, that they don't call themselves any particular name. There is a sort of general sense of Valencian culture, but that's not something that I'm going to be writing about anyway. I think symbolically, this was rather well captured by a woman who I met, a Swedish anthropologist who was doing an ethnographic study of a public housing area in the city of Valencia itself. And she said, I've been doing the fieldwork now for a year in this public housing project, and I'm the only person who's still there after a year. So she was studying, she was like standing on a railroad platform and the trains are going through. She was studying, and all the people at the beginning were not there at the end. I mean, so that was a sort of extreme case of the situation. In any event, the thing that emerged, so that's the specific question, but the more general question, I think, is if you are committed to a kind of anthropology in the school of political economy, then actually how do you fit an ethnographic study into the broader fields of force that you find it in? And I think that's the sort of more general challenge. The way in which we did it in this particular book, again, sort of came out of the field work. The area that I did my field work in was an area where shoes are made. anything from Reeboks to what do you call those flip-flop shoes? You know, I can't remember what they're called now. But anyway, you know, they're pretty high quality shoes, and they were all made in the central factory would be a maximum of 100 or 150 workers. The rest of the production is made through outwork, people working in their homes, and through semi-legal workshops in which children would work putting gluing the shoes together and so on. So the area is an area around Elche, which is the major shoe producing area of Spain, but it actually spreads out through the region, and people are simultaneously working in irrigated agriculture on the one hand, and also working in some forms of outwork on the other. And this may be gender specific, or it may be people moving through these things in different periods of the year, or even through different times in their life cycle. So there's something quite specific about this. This is a situation where people have become very good at instantly adapting to different kinds of economic changes. If there's a demand for a certain kind of shoe production, people will make shoes. If there's a demand for artichokes, they'll go and start growing artichokes. There's a kind of the classic thing that neoliberalism wants from workers, flexible workers in a certain sense. So the way in which this was dealt with in European development projects was that in the 80s and 90s, the European Union became very interested in what it called regional economies. And the idea was that there was local knowledge in regional economies that couldn't be reproduced elsewhere, and that was actually could be captured and used as a way of developing the area. So the model was the Third Italy, which is the area just to the north of Milan, that includes Emilia-Romagna and Parma and Bologna. Bologna would be the center of the Third Italy. And in the Third Italy, you have small businesses employing local people and an incredible amount of ingenuity and change taking place. So the Third Italy became a kind of model for developing these regional economies. And the idea was that there were sort of particular kinds of cultures that were very good for developing a certain kind of efficient kinds of capitalism. So that's actually what we wrote the book around. We basically asked ourselves, okay, is this an identifiable regional economy? And what is happening to people in this area when all kinds of policies are coming down saying, this is the way we want you to be. We want you to be an entrepreneurial worker. We want you to be flexible. We want you to actually, although it wasn't said, we don't mind at all if you exploit your children, and so on. So this was a perfect way for us to link up the ethnography that I had done to a much broader question, which is, do regional economies actually work, or are they in fact more exploitative than an older kind of relationship? And we found, of course, that they were incredibly exploitative, and that a lot of the ways in which people are used in the labor process are sort of over-exploitation. And in some ways, this actually relates to the whole loss of memory that I've been talking about, because one of the reasons why people are so able to adapt to quite rapid changes in the economy and so on is because they were so used to working in the black economy during Franco's time. People were very, very used to making these kind of shifts. semi-legal moves and so on and so forth. So that was very much partly to do with it. Also, the whole way in which the patriarchal structure of the family during the Franco regime was absolutely perfect for outwork, putting outwork into women's households, where women would be the sort of the people who were making the shoes or weaving the shoes and so on. So one example would be that I found it extremely difficult to interview people in the way anthropologists do, because they were so busy working at their machines, their stitching machines and so on, in their houses. So I was trying to find these women to talk to them about, what they thought was work and what they didn't think was work. I mean, is looking after the kids work, or is working on the machine work, or whatever? So anyway, I was coming home one day, and one of my neighbors said to me, "Well, how's it going, Gavin? How's your fieldwork going on?" And I said, "Well, I've got all these bloody questionnaires. I can't find anybody to give them to. I found one woman, but then I can't find anybody else, and they're much too busy anyway." And she says to me, "Well, you idiot." She said, "What are you doing it for? I can do it. I've got all my friends. You give me the bits of paper. I'll go around and start." So she started circulating these things. And one of the questions I was asking was, what do you think is work? I mean, if you look after your daughter's 2 children during the day while she's working in one of these workshops or something, is that work, or is that just, being a good granny or whatever? So anyway, I did this. After about a month, the woman came back, and she'd got about 30 or 40 of these things done. And she'd got some really pissed off women. And she said, "We're really pissed off with you for having got this. You've started a whole bunch of rows now." There were people who were going over to visit their neighbors with the children to help them put shoes in boxes, and thought that they were helping the person. The other person thought they were helping the other person because they were looking after their children while they were doing the job, and so on and so forth. So that started out that there was a whole series of tensions. But gradually, as they began to talk to each other about it, they realized that the real point of tension were the outwork, the putter-outers, the jobbers that were actually bringing the work to them, who always turned out to be relatives of the people that they did it for. So the way in which the exploitation takes place is, you are my niece, I expect you to do extra work when the shoes don't quite fit properly or aren't done properly. And because you're my niece, I want you to do it. And if you were a good niece, you would do it. And gradually what began to happen during my fieldwork was people who were caught in those kinds of patriarchal sorts of situations began to resist. And the way in which they resisted was by switching to other kinds of jobbers, other kind of outworkers who had no relationship to them at all, so that they could actually bargain with them in a much more direct way. So that would be a sort of example of the way regional economies kind of worked, not in an especially nice way. So that's one of the things. That's really a lot of what the book's about. After I'd become interested in all this stuff about memory, and I began to realize that the whole memory issue was much more than just memory. It was a lot to do with sort of current political engagement or non-engagement or whatever. I'd also become interested in the way in which the European Union was becoming much more thoroughly embedded in the ordinary lives of Europeans, continental Europeans. That is to say, it struck me that if you were in an Italian, in the Third Italy, for example, and you were talking to a small entrepreneur who's got a little business of some kind or other, you would be staggered at how well he would know the various rules of the European Union for getting a subsidy because he's, got an extra parking lot or whatever the things are. Contrast that with Spain, where they have absolutely no knowledge at all about what the European Union's laws are. And think about the fact that people in Italy have for long been knowledgeable about the way the Italian state manages these kinds of things. Whereas under Franco, everybody knew there was you had no pressure on the state at all. There was nothing you could do. The state was going to do whatever it liked, whether you liked it or not. So there's a kind of history of how people get involved. And gradually, I began to realize that the European Union itself is actually becoming, for people in certain parts of continental Europe, and of course things are changing now. I started writing this project back in about 2005, to the point where people were thinking about and moving around Europe in a way that really had changed in the course of the European Union. So I decided that what I would do is I would take a town in France, a peri-urban area, an area just out on the edge of a town in France, and a similar town in Spain, and look to see the extent to which the European Union's rules and regulations and culture, various cultural projects as well, and then the French state and the regional state, how people dealt with them, and compare them from one place to another, the French case, which would have been Montpellier, for example, and the Spanish case, say Alicante. So compare the places, but actually do life histories of people so that you could find out, whether the movements had changed, whether the kinds of ways they found credit changed, the kinds of doing that on a sort of slightly historical basis, at least over the last 20 or 30 years. So that was the way I began to write the project. But I was still interested in this issue of Republicans and memory. And so I decided that I noticed that in the municipal elections, when Sarkozy won so many conservative seats in municipal elections in France, this was a few years ago, there was one area where he absolutely did not penetrate at all, and that was the area around Toulouse. And if you actually looked at these small municipalities around Toulouse, if you actually looked at the constitution of the mayors or the council, you found a remarkable number of Spanish names. So it turned out, of course, that these were all the communities that had been settled by Republicans just after the Civil War. So I decided that what I really wanted to do was to find out in a series of 3 generations how changes in the relationship between Spain and non-Spain had changed as a result of how the European Union and so on had actually changed people's lives. So I focused on this area around Toulouse, and I focused on an area around Tarragona, just to the south of Barcelona or to the west of Barcelona, for trying to find Republican families. So that's what I'm still sort of fairly locked into that kind of research. And I mean, I think it is extremely interesting the way it's worked. And I'll give you a rather interesting example. There's an area just to the south of Tarragona, inland from Tarragona, that has now become a target for wind farms. And the community where these wind farms is being put up is very, very divided. It's divided basically between people who feel that wind farms are a good thing. They're obviously good for the environment and so on. And then people who feel that actually the local environment is being destroyed. And they want to preserve the local environment, which means not having windmills. And so you've got this kind of dispute going on. And it's been going on for quite a long time. So a friend of mine is doing field work in this particular area, Jaume Franquesa. And so Jaume one day phones me up and says, "You've got to come and speak. I've got somebody here and she's desperate to talk to you." And I'm desperate to talk to me. "Yeah, because I told her about your project about the Republicans in Toulouse and she wants to talk to you." So I went and interviewed this woman who tells me that her father was an anarchist in this village during the Civil War. The village itself was a Republican village, so it was supporting the Republic and against Franco. But it was somewhat divided in its the various currents of support for the Republic. During the war, about 10 or 12 anarchist military people came into the community and executed about 22 people in the community, presumably because they had a much more liberal Republican view. They didn't want to distribute the land in the way the anarchists wanted or whatever. We don't entirely know. But they came from we do know they came from another community. As a result, the 2 or 3 anarchists maybe there were more, 4 or 5 anarchists in the village who were openly anarchist were told to get out of the village. I mean, they would have been killed by other people in the village. So this man and his wife fled to France, to Orléans, in fact, before the end of the Civil War. They had a child. He got a job, the father got a job in the factory. By the time the child was 12 years old, he was killed in an accident in the factory. And so she was then left with her mother, who was a very staunch Catholic and actually thought about going back to Spain at this point. But was advised by local Republicans or exiles, Spanish exiles, that she would be crazy to go back to Spain. This would have been in the 50s at that point, that apart from the obvious reasons why she might not want to go back, which is that her husband was an anarchist. The simple fact that Spain was not in nearly as good a shape as France was at that particular point. This is when the girl is about 12 years old. By the time she's 15, her mother dies of cancer, and the girl is now an orphan. The judiciary who look after children in this situation assigned her to a foster home, but the condition was that she should return to the village of her origin every summer during the school holidays. So here this child, who's been brought up in France throughout her life, finds herself having to go back to the village in Spain where her father is a notorious anarchist, Franco's Spain. Nobody speaks to her. She's 16 or 17 years old, and she has to do it every summer. And of course, she has to relearn Catalan because she spoke Spanish, but she didn't speak Catalan. And then during the course of this time, she actually does meet somebody in the village. They fall in love and they get married. But she can't really live in the village, so she actually lives in Tarragona, which is the sort of town near to this town. So she's very strongly committed to the village. She hasn't actually lived there. She's grown up in France. The village, meanwhile, is in a huge dispute, which I'm talking about 4 years ago, between whether to have wind farms or whether not to have wind farms. And gradually they realize that it's the old anarchist families who are against the wind farms, who want to preserve the local territory and the local terroir for being what it was, and it's that kind of thing. And it's the more liberal Republican families who want to have the wind farms. And they realize that there's absolutely no way they can resolve this dispute. So they decide to have a peace and reconciliation commission set up between these two families. And where will they have it? In one of the villages in Toulouse. So one of the villages in Toulouse gathers together all the people who come from this region, Republicans from different backgrounds, different political backgrounds, and they visit the village and then go back and decide that they will have a kind of peace and reconciliation kind of commission. And the person who is the intermediary between these two groups is this woman, who's now a woman of 60 years old. But there's a kind of lovely story of how space changes through time. I mean, I think it's a very interesting kind of a story. So I think the only other one, which again is about how the kind of spaces that ethnography anthropologists have to deal with it's a good illustration. I'm trying to remember if I actually said this to you, but I've decided that I'm going back to northern Italy now to do research on the Peruvians who are now, to a great extent, illegal migrants in northern Italy. So that will be kind of the next part of my research, will be to actually interview families, find out, how they got there. One of the people that I talked to a couple of years ago has actually been kicked out of Italy 6 times and come back every time. One of my godchildren was dumped out of a rubber dinghy about a kilometer offshore near Brindisi and didn't know how to swim and managed to get ashore. So the stories are pretty amazing. So that's one of the that's one of the things I'm going to be doing next, I think. And again, I think it does speak to this whole issue of spatiality, because these people are very much identifying with the community back in Italy, and the question is why? Why does it not just disappear? It doesn't, for some reason. What do I think about being an anthropologist today, or what anthropology is all about today? I guess it's an interesting question. I think it's a really difficult question to answer without talking about the structure of the university itself and what's happening to people trying to do graduate work in the university now. I mean, I'm very involved at the University of Toronto. Not very involved, I should be more involved, but I'm involved with a group of people who are trying to critique the university's involvement with the corporations, corporate sector, and particularly it all started in my case with the funding of the Global Studies Center by Barrick Gold, which is of course the biggest gold extracting company in the world, with some of the worst human rights record of any of those kind of extractive companies. So I think that, if I think about what I've been talking about today and the ease with which I was able to go off and study rebellious peasants in Latin America, or do a research project on how funding has modified social science research, I can't imagine that a young academic today would be wise to choose those kinds of research projects and hope to get the kind of resources and support that I felt that was going to be relatively easy. So I think it's very difficult for a professional academic to know how to do the kind of socially relevant work that they would like to do in the context of a situation where the possibilities of getting a secure job in an academic community is really hard. And the result is that, of course, you find yourself looking for the niches and the opportunities in order simply to have that kind of career. And that means that you're not nearly as free to simply say, I want to do this particular thing, and whether or not anybody else is going to fund it or is interested in it doesn't matter to me. I'm simply going to do it. I mean, that's a way of making yourself completely irrelevant, or getting out of the academic game altogether. Interestingly enough, this particular group that I'm involved in, 3 weeks ago, no, it was a bit more than 3 weeks ago, about a month or so ago, we invited Naomi Klein to come and talk to us about this topic of, what can academics do politically speaking. And it did strike me that it was actually slightly ironic that here we, the academics, were asking the one intellectual who's not tied to an academy at all what we should do, and she's obviously decided what she's going to do. She's obviously not tied up in the academy. I think that, in some ways, it's almost as though the opportunity that was offered to go, if you think about how I started out this narrative of saying, I was somebody who was in an absolutely classic bourgeois job, investment banking, and I wanted to do something else. I wanted to be politically effective. And for some reason or other, I chose to go into a university context in order to do that, into anthropology, in fact, because I felt that anthropology had this kind of grassroots kind of side to it. And that seemed a relatively natural thing to do. I'm not saying it was the right thing to do. Perhaps I should have gone and become a union organizer or something, I don't know. But the point is that it seemed a fairly straightforward way. In other words, the idea of being in an academic community would seem to me to be a way of having a jump-off point to actually have some effect on society in the way that I wanted to. I wouldn't say that today at all. I mean, it seems to me that if anything, the university community is a ball and chain around your legs. It's going to actually restrict what you can do. I don't know what the alternative is if you want to be a free-thinking intellectual who has some kind of effect on society. Where would you go in order to do that if you were not going to find yourself in the university? Is there some other kind of institute that would make that sort of thing possible? I really don't know the answer to that. So I say that as a preface to saying, what might anthropology do now? And I think it's really difficult because I look at my younger colleagues in my department, and my department has the social cultural anthropology part of my department. Oh, it's doubled since I was there. I mean, since I started, I think there were probably about 12 of us when I started when I sort of became settled, which is probably around 1980. And now, when I think we have about 27 or 28 social cultural anthropologists at the University of Toronto. And then, if I was to look at the kinds of things that they're doing, I don't think very many of them would be immediately, how can I put this? Obviously they have political implications, and many of them do have political implications. And I think it's pretty impressive that people are trying to do that kind of work. But I think also, there's in some ways the pendulum has swung. When I was starting in anthropology, doing what would have been called exotic work was very much frowned upon. Everybody was trying to do ordinary anthropology. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think we're back at a situation where it's perfectly fine. There's lots of work that people can do on what I would call the edges of social science orthodoxy, which is where anthropologists operate very well and can be very, very, very interesting. So I think that that's the case. I still think that, people of my generation, that's about as far down the line we go. We don't really think about people. I'm thinking of the 27 people who've actually got tenure in my department, or they're in a tenure stream. But of course, there's a whole bunch of other interim teachers who are graduate students, have got their PhDs, but still don't have jobs. And again, I just don't know how they can have the kind of leverage that most intellectuals want to have with the work that they're doing. So I think that's pretty tricky. I think that's a tricky one. But if you were to start sort of asking questions about, broadly speaking, what should anthropology be doing that it can do as well, if not better, than other disciplines, I think you've only just got to turn and look across the border. You've got to explain what was going on that resulted in somebody like Donald Trump becoming president of an extremely powerful country. And I think that there's a lot of work for anthropologists to be doing in that particular area, because we clearly need to know a lot more about that kind of thing. And the same goes for the Brexit situation in England and or Poland or Hungary. I think that anthropologists are probably people who have the best training and the best methods for trying to understand that little kind of emotional trigger that can set people off. Just this morning I was reading on the BBC website, and they had a picture of a guy who said, "Yeah, I voted for Trump. I think he's a bit of a nutter, and I wouldn't trust him to run my own business or my own household. But I thought, yeah, well, we need a change." And I thought, anybody who can put somebody in a position of such power on those kind of grounds, there must be something I'm not getting here. And I think there is this kind of relation between emotion and rationality that we should be probably working at. I think that's kind of where anthropology will go. I think anthropology's hugely more interesting and more relevant to the world today than it was when I started. At the time, before when I started getting into anthropology. I really do. I think it's quite fascinating. And then, the issue of anthropology in Canada is a really interesting question too. Anthropology in Canada, to a certain extent, certainly in Anglophone Canada, started as applied anthropology, really. And the applied anthropology component in Canada is very strong and goes back to Hawthorne and British Columbia, really. So I think Canada and the whole issue of the Indigenous communities in Canada is so hugely important. And if you want to talk about Spain's attempts to produce an ersatz or false collective consciousness perhaps we should turn ourselves to Canada and ask ourselves about, how Canada desperately is trying to produce some sort of collective consciousness that's involves so many elements of denial that I think anthropologists are pretty well suited to trying to expose. That's it, I think.